Hey, my name is Garrett from Silent Planet, and we are going to be discussing the lyrics and the themes of our new album, When the End Began. Thus Spoke continues where the last track of our previous album, Everything Was Sound, leaves off. And in that previous album, basically I was walking through a panopticon, which is an invention made by a utilitarian philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, and it is a mode of social control. And so I was walking from room to room of people's different mind states. So at the end of that album, I basically had this vision of everyone coming out of their rooms and reaching inside their chest, as weird and mystical as it sounds, and pulling out a seed and planting the tree of life in the middle of the panopticon. Because in the middle of the panopticon, this machine was this dark tower that basically controlled people by letting them know that you're being watched all the time, which is kind of, there's a link in our current society, and the philosopher Foucault actually spoke a lot about panopticism. So in that last album, this tower that controls people is basically torn apart by creation, and everything starts again. And I'm in the middle of that because I realize that, to some sense, I contribute to that gaze of society. That like my privilege watching other people contributes to that problem. So I'm torn apart as well, along with the tower. So this album basically picks up and with the song "Thus Spoke" that tells the story of being lost in this lightless sleep, which for me has actually been a period of depression that I've been going through for quite a while now. And as something that I've been open with, I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so it picks up with me basically looking at what I've been going through, and also introing this idea of this new album where we're going to be passing through black holes and watching basically matter and time end and then begin again. And so the album, which is called When the End Began, examines this idea of, Nietzsche called it eternal recurrence or eternal return. And in the Bhagavad Gita, which I always get that name wrong, I never pronounce it right, but talks about every day light is annihilated and then light is born again. And so we look at apocalypse throughout this album. In apocalypse, we have an understanding in the West of Armageddon. You know, Bruce Willis, the comet is coming, the world's going to end. But apocalypse in Greek literally means new vision or new witness. And so this album is an exploration of the moments in whether it's in someone's life or the moments in society that something happens that forever will shift how we understand ourselves and we understand other people. It's like you can't remain the same now that you've encountered this. And so this album is a series of apocalypses that I've had in my life as I've witnessed people telling me their stories at shows. And after I talk to someone who's addicted to heroin, I think I can no longer be the same, because my understanding of you and drugs and substance abuse in America has changed because of this conversation. So this album is basically going to be a bunch of apocalypses, and is looking for the common thread between micro-apocalypse, which is what I would call internal paradigm shift, and macro-apocalypse. So Thus Spoke is, this is a lengthy introduction to it, but Thus Spoke is basically setting the reader up for like, this is the next chapter, and that's why the song ends with "The night God slept, everything was sound, when the end began." So we're going to be moving towards what Nietzsche speaks about, Thus Spoke, which is eternal return. The new eternity, we felt like lyrically and musically it made sense to really make this the first full track of the record, because this is looking at kind of a macro event. What happened after World War II is that America conducted something called Operation Paperclip, where we took Nazi scientists from Germany and then brought them back to America. And a lot of them continued some of the work that they were doing in social psychology, on manipulation, on hypnotism, on chemical warfare. And that's why in the song there's a line where I say, "The darkness didn't die, we brought it home." Is that the myth of violence is that we will just have one more war and then we will have lasting peace, you know? Because they said World War I was the war to end all wars, right? And then what happens? World War II. Because violence, and from my understanding and from my spiritual belief, only begets violence. And so we have this myth of the new eternity. The new eternity is almost a tongue-in-cheek kind of reference, because we keep thinking that we're going to commit one more grave act of violence, you know, a nuclear bomb against the Japanese, one more thing to stop it, and that'll be it. But now we live in terror of, you know, Kim Jong-un or Donald Trump launching a nuclear weapon, right? And so this kind of looks at how we've taken, war just leads to more war, and in the modern age, it's led to a manipulation of nature. And so the song also investigates Agent Orange, Unit 731 by the Japanese, the Nazi experiments on the body, and basically looks at not just the myth of redemptive violence, but also is examining what happens when science has no moral premise. What happens when we don't agree on basic things like human life has dignity or value, and you just let knowledge is everything, right? And so if I could sum up the song in one sentence, I would say that knowledge is always empty unless if it leads you to truth, and understanding that there's a distinction between knowledge and truth. And that's something that a lot of people in the scientific community have had to learn the hard way as really horrible things have been conducted against marginalized people in the name of science. Northern Fires is another macro apocalypse. In this song, we're talking about the Spanish Civil War. That is I think that was the beginning of a new kind of war. As you know, it kicked off right before World War II, and some people call it the fuse that lit the World War II. And in that war, America actually sent some troops over to fight on behalf of the common people, against the fascists. Because a general who was once in exile came back with his army, Franco, and basically overtook what was once a liberal, free society, and basically brought fascism back to Spain. And so what I thought was most compelling about the story of the Spanish Civil War, and I actually started writing it when I was living in Spain, and seeing the monuments and reading about it, is that America sends its troops over to fight on behalf of these people, and simultaneously is funding the fascists. In Texaco Oil, Ford Trucks, a lot of the biggest companies in the world, not just in America, but the biggest companies in the world, made their riches funding fascism. Because one of the most immediate ways to get rich is find out who's going to win the war and then help them win the war. Because war is a very costly endeavor. And so the very sad thing about the Spanish Civil War is we see the person versus the machine, basically. We see a new kind of war where it's being waged by economic decisions, and it's being won by, you know, handshakes in rooms 5,000 miles away, because globalization has changed it. So it's no longer two people picking up their sword and one person dies. You know, now it's a question of, well, who's the most profitable person to fund? And those same companies funded Hitler even. And these are American companies, and I see their commercials, you know, Texaco, we're good for America. It's like, you funded the fascists against American soldiers who died in the name of what they believed was real. And while I don't believe that any kind of fighting leads to peace, I also think that it's worth telling these stories of people who wanted to fight on behalf of just the common person, someone they didn't even understand. And Ernest Hemingway actually speaks about that in For Whom the Bell Tolls, when he talks about it is better to have fight and to have loved, you know, than to have never chosen to make a stand at all, and to have never have lived and to be a coward. And so I guess that song is looking at the people who threw their lives towards something they believed was great while being betrayed by their own country and their own businesses, you know. After Dusk, I actually started writing it a few weeks before we went into the studio. I was walking on the beach in San Diego, California, very cool beach, and I saw like thousands of dead bees. And I was like literally, I was barefoot, but I had to watch my step because there was bees everywhere, and they were dead in the sand. And a friend of mine who lives there was telling me about how bees are flying towards the ocean to die now. And I don't know if you've heard about the colony collapse, but bees are dying in mass numbers. And to some extent they know why. There's been some like parasites that enter their brains and literally make them go haywire. But some people believe it has to do with industrialization. Some people believe it even has to do with cell phones. There's a lot of theories, but that led me to just kind of a greater exploration of what is environmentalism. Because to be honest, I, like most Americans, haven't thought a lot about like what is my carbon footprint in the world. And touring in a band, you leave quite a footprint because you're just driving 24/7. And so I really wanted to look at, like, you know, to what degree am I culpable for what I see happening in the world. And that led to a lot of reading. Our producer, Will Putney, is actually a vegan, so he told me a lot about veganism and how it's an environmental decision for him. And yeah, that kind of started a journey. So After Dusk kind of explores the different avenues where we're looking one way towards what we think is progress, and meanwhile we're destroying the one thing that we have. And so in that song I say, pull the blood from the earth and you'll leave a grave for your sons. And I'm kind of investigating, like, what does that look like? And I was really, that was kind of a song where I was like going through a lot of self-discovery, because I was realizing how much I was doing that was just wasteful, and I never really had thought about it. You know, just using like plastic cups when I could just use a mug, you know, just basic things. And so that song's almost sort of a confession in realizing that, like, until I'm respecting the earth, how can I actually say that I'm respecting other people? And how can I say that how can I care about poverty around the world when famine is being caused by decisions that we make in the first world, you know? So that was a pretty painful one for me, and doesn't really leave off on a light note, because you just kind of keep living. And that's sort of one of the things that I struggle with is talking about these songs, but then, okay, well, we got to go get gas now and keep driving across America. But I'm still learning. I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around that and think, like, how can I, you know, maybe leave the earth better off than how I left it. So, yeah. Visible Unseen was actually a song that I decided to start writing after a series of conversations that happened over the course of a tour we were on. I met several transgender youth and spoke with them about their life experience. Most of them had grown up in religious households, and when they came out to their family as LGBT, any of the above, they were essentially disowned. And I've talked to several 16-year-old kids who sleep on couches of friends' families because they aren't accepted. And I've actually seen some of them turn to drugs and other things. And so watching the hypocrisy of people who claim to follow this character Jesus, who is loving and someone that I try to follow is Jesus, and someone who is loving to, they say, the least of these, or people that didn't have a place in society, and using that same name to justify kicking out not just some person but their own kin was really horrifying. And so wanting to write a song about the homeless epidemic in America too. I don't know if that's a thing around the world, but in America it's a disproportionate number of LGBT kids are homeless. And so that song examines that phenomenon, mostly from the first person, from the stories of them, but also switching to my perspective and seeing how, like, I was blind to that for a long time. I didn't realize that, and now that I do, asking, like, how can I make this band a safe space for those people? How can I make these shows a safe space for LGBT youth. And actually that song, probably more than anything, was really emotional for me. At one point in the song, I asked God, I ask of you benevolence, was I made just to be broken? And that's something directly from a kid I talked to who said, hey, I'm a Christian, but I was raised to believe that I can't be gay. So did God make me like to be bad? Like, am I like a cosmic joke? And that's a really, 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 really hard thing to see in someone's eyes, to believe that a God exists, but they'll never be good enough because of who they are and how they love. And it hurts because I've seen so many Christians respond with, well, you know, I love this, I hate the sin and I love the sinner. But in my responses is like, how do you expect to decide exactly where their sin is? If someone's gay and this is their identity, this is how they see the world, because sexuality is everything. It's how we dress, it's how we walk, it's how we think. Sexuality informs our personhood. So how can you say like, I love you, but I also don't like all of this? You know, how's that possible? And to ask that question, you know, because I do know very, very loving, compassionate, religious people who also don't think they can tolerate gay people. And I want to ask people, how can you be loving? How can you be like the Jesus that you talk about if you can't be anywhere near these people? You know, what does that look like if they're an infectious disease for how they see the world? And so that was a really emotional one, and a song that I'm really excited for people to hear, and I'm sure some people will hate us for it, maybe a little bit, but if it can maybe make one person feel seen, because I call it the visible unseen, because it's people that I'd been seeing for a long time. They were visible to me, but I didn't see them. You know, it's the difference between when you're looking at something, but when you're seeing it. And so that song's also kind of a cry for me to be able to see those people that don't have a place because of who they are, and need to be accepted and loved and told, like, you are a beautiful child of God. You're not broken. You don't have to. You don't have to hide who you are. You know. So yeah. So that song is the first of 2 interludes in the album. And I guess I'll just cover this now. That is from a quote from Carl Jung. He says, the one who looks outside dreams, and the one who looks within awakes. And Carl Jung had a pretty big role to play in my understanding of, I would say this album, but also last album, every album. You know, as you know, he's a disciple of Sigmund Freud, but he really dabbled a lot in the idea of the collective unconscious, and the idea that we share sort of the consciousness of our ancestors within how we see the world, and our past is embedded in the language we use. And he talked about the anima and the animus, you know, the idea that we experience essentially both in all genders within how we see the world. And probably the most profound thing, there's a story about Carl Jung, I don't even know if it's true, but I like to think it is, where a student said, can you diagram the self? You know, you talk about the self, can you diagram it? And he drew a circle, and it was a snake, it's Ouroboros eating his tail. And he said, that is the self. We continually turn into ourselves. And for a long time I dreaded that idea of like, I'm stuck. But I actually realized there's a certain beauty in realizing that like we are circles. Like, and when we understand ourselves as circles, I think our circle can expand and we can grow, because it's not the myth of like, I'm going up in this world, like I'm becoming a better me, I'm leaving myself behind, but instead learning to like love and forgive who I am, and in reconciling myself within myself. And so the idea of, you know, look outside, dream is as long as I'm looking out, as long as I'm trying to find myself in someone else, or trying to like find my identity out there, I'm gonna miss the fact that like I need to actually do the internal work, the hard work of finding who I am, you know, deep inside. Vanity of Sleep is a song about consumerism, primarily. It was inspired by so many so many 20th century philosophers, Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, modern pieces of art like Fight Club and Mr. Robot. And this song really kind of looks at what I call modern consumer despair. That we're living in a world where our sense of value is informed by how much we have and what we have, which I think, I know contributes to the depression, the anxiety that we see, and that it's really hard to find meaning in the modern world. In the first world, it's not super hard to survive as far as eating, sleeping. You know, some people have it harder than others, but ultimately there's a lot of systems in place to keep, you know, mass starvation. Like we've built this modern, seemingly perfect world, yet there's so much hopelessness, you know. And so we start to find ourselves in what we own, and what we own begins to own us, you know. And so the song really investigates what that looks like, which is why I say this is a love affair with consumer despair and emptiness I can call my own. Because I see so much of what we own is literally walking around showing that we don't have things. It's a kind of a paradox. Like there's a physical representation of like a spiritual or like a soul lacking. And really a lot of this is based on Marx's concept of alienation. And I got a lot of hate when I said Karl Marx, and Karl Marx is in the footnotes. I'm personally not a communist, but Karl Marx, I read him as a philosopher of human nature, and he once said, humans are homo faber. I talk about this in interviews all the time because I'm fascinated by it. We say homo sapiens when we talk about people typically, you know, like that's what the aliens call us in all the sci-fi movies. But he said we're homo faber. Homo faber means we are working beings, that we're defined by our work. In his critique of capitalism, namely Henry Ford assembly line capitalism, is when you are just the person who screws on the lid to the toothpaste bottle, you're alienated from the whole process of creating toothpaste. You're just a toothpaste bottle screwer. And the idea is that the mind and the body is so much more complex. We're meant to do more than just screw on toothpaste caps. And so he says you get alienated from your work. And once you're alienated from the work of your hands, you become alienated from yourself, from your personality, from the people you love. And so I'm basically looking at the stages of alienation throughout that song. And in one part of the song, I say, I built a home overlooking a graveyard to remind myself I'm alive. And the idea that, you know, if I could just watch other people die, then I know I'm still alive. And then I'm struck still by the terror where I see a constant reminder, but yeah, you're gonna die too. Because even life itself is something we try to quantify, but we can't own it. And no matter how many advances in healthcare, and now they're working on putting brains in bodies or bodies with brains, you know, we're gonna die. And so much of our life is just running away from the inevitable fact that we're gonna die. So I think the song is about embracing who we are, embracing humanity, and realizing that we need a deeper story to know who we are. We need a more profound narrative that can inform us of who we are and why we are than simply what we own. And maybe looking at our lives and saying, to what degree does, you know, my MacBook that I own, does it actually own me? You know, to what degree do I orient myself around checking my phone every 5 minutes? And really looking for a deeper self that isn't a physical object that's just gonna end up burning, you know? In Absence is one of those, what I would say, micro-apocalypses. We wrote it about memory disorders, memory loss disorders. And it's actually the first song we ever wrote that's primarily a rock song, actually. When you listen to it, it's not really a metalcore song. It is kind of a love song to a few people in my life. One was kind of a surrogate grandmother for me. Another is like a surrogate aunt. Actually visited her a couple months ago at the hospital. But people who you know, suffer through dementia and Alzheimer's. And it's kind of a look at how do you love someone when they're not even themselves anymore? Because you realize that we are a combination of our life experiences and our memories and our opinions, and it's like, who is the person when they lose that, you know? And how do you love that person when they don't know who you are, when you're as much of a stranger as their nurse is? And looking at, asking that question, and then sort of coming to a resolution towards the end of it, where I said, I'll turn with your reversing clock, and I'll describe the color when you can't see the sunrise, and the idea that there is value in going through that with someone, and you do honor their memory, even if they don't know you at that time, and even if they don't know why you keep showing up, why you stay there for them. I believe that's what love is. Love is when someone has nothing to offer. And I mean, who has nothing to offer more than someone who doesn't even know who you are? They have no memories left to offer. They have no love to offer, but you continue to love them because that's who they are, and they still have value and dignity, you know, despite not having their memories. So, yeah. Share the Body is about the opioid epidemic around the world. Once again, I mostly know about it from personal experience in the United States, but I do know for a fact that it's an issue around the world, especially in the developing world. In the music video, I feel like I should explain this somewhere because people have asked me about it and I haven't had time to respond to it on the comments. In the music video, it starts with me walking into a church, and you see people coming and exiting the pews. And then the camera turns, and the preacher, the person doing the service, is a doctor, and so I'm kind of in this drug church. And the reason I used a church is because going back to that idea of like, we've lost some of the old stories of who we are. I think one way that people look for salvation now is not the church anymore. And by no means am I saying it needs to be the church. I'm simply describing what I see. But people, I don't think, a lot of people don't find their salvation or their, you know, what's gonna save me from a church. We look for it in the pharmaceutical industry. We look for it in the medical sphere. And unfortunately, there's people and there's I would say malicious actors at play in the pharmaceutical world who are pushing products that they know are addictive, that they know are harmful because of profit. You know, they pay, in America, several times FDA has been paid to look the other way while drugs get put on the market that are unsafe and that are addictive. I wrote this song, like a lot of our songs, based on conversations I've had with people at shows. There's one young person in America who I see every time we're on tour who's addicted to heroin and is a teenager and is homeless. And it breaks my heart to know that this person is dying as long as they're addicted. And I've talked to this person, but it's a nasty addiction, and coming out of it takes the greatest degree of bravery because you basically commit yourself to an incredible period of torment, physical and mental. And so many people are addicted, and the thing that's striking about the heroin epidemic is it's really, they can't track it by race or by social sphere or by wealth or income. It's hitting everyone because these medications, while they block, you know, they block certain receptors of pain, in the long term, they will take everything from you and oftentimes lead to overdose. And so at the end of the song, I should actually give a shout out to T.S. Eliot too. The love song about for J. Prufrock was a pretty big part of how I wrote it. I think that's the greatest poem in history, personally. I think T.S. Eliot's the greatest poet of history. And T.S. Eliot, in the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock, is basically this old guy who's fantasizing about being great and being something. And I realized that so much of addiction is fantasy. It's the idea of like, I'll get better after this next dose. I'll just one more fix and then I'll be fine and then I'll be good. But it's all a myth, it's all a lie. It's all smoke and mirrors. It leads nowhere. And so in that song, in the middle part of the song, I say, let us go then, you and I. And I say ether eyes, just like T.S. Eliot does about the night sky. And then at the end I say, don't you know me by these marks, these scars where I are? I mean I am, I mean I was supposed to be someone. And it's the realization of you're talking to this addiction, this thing you love it more than anything, because I've seen how addicted people will trade family, love, friends, everything for addiction. People have called heroin the liar's drug before. I've heard that at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. It's the liar's drug because people will do anything to protect it. It's like the ring in Lord of the Rings, you know, we're smuggled anything for the precious, for that fix. And so at the end of the song, I basically describe, musically and lyrically goes into an overdose. Say I hit the bottom, then it hit me back. And then I say incarnation of society, the face of evil is the face of need. And my concept there is that if you look at a heroin addict, I think you see the most accurate depiction of Western society. It's all need. It's all consumed. It's more. And so it makes sense that we're spiritually in a place of consumption, and that would translate into how we understand how drugs are pure consumption. It's consumption for the sake of consumption. You know, unlike food or water or different things that you could say there's a different means to the end, drugs are consumption for consumption. And so I think when we look at addiction, it needs not to be, oh, those horrible, disgusting addicts, but instead, we participate in a society that pushes this addiction. From the legislation to the law, to the ways that we consume, to the ways that we criminalize people that are addicted, because people that are addicted shouldn't be treated like criminals. They should be treated as sick people who need to get better. Because you don't, you know, throwing people in prison or you know, like, that doesn't do anything. We learned that. And in America, we have a disproportionate amount of African American people who are incarcerated. We have the largest prison population in the planet, actually, who are incarcerated on minor drug offenses, who maybe could have benefited from rehab or from some sort of social work, but instead are thrown into prison for 20 years, which just costs a lot of money for taxpayers, and it's traumatic for them. And then they get out and there's no social skills, because once again, we see drugs as this means you're a criminal instead of this means you need help. So, yeah. Ja, Vanity, and it means you bury me, and it's an Arabic phrase. That's we use the anglicized version of that, frankly, because our computers can't figure out the other one. But you bury me, so the song Firstborn, You Bury Me is sort of a follow-up to First Father, which was a follow-up to First Mother. And Firstborn is about actually two young people two children who died, who I was close to. One of them was one of my best friend's sons, and another one is actually a young man that we met on tour who had liver cancer. And we were able to, as a band, visit him in hospice 2 days before he was taken off of life support. And you bury me, the phrase means literally, I need you to bury me, or like, I need to die before you do. I need you to be the one who buries me, because I don't know how to live without you. And that song sort of sums up that phrase, that in losing these children, I watch these people I love, you know, go through an apocalypse of their own, that they'll never be the same losing this child, this massive part of who they are. But also, to do honor to their memory, they need to continue to live. They need to find a way to cope. As a couple, they need to find a way to love each other and to go through. As you know, divorce rate is very, very high for people who lose a child. And I wrote that song not just for these people I love, but a lot of couples I've met on tour who have lost children recently. There's a couple I met in Boston on a recent tour who had lost a son almost right before we went there 2 weeks before, and they said this was the first time they left their house. was to be at their show and to see the pain that they carried. I want to write a song that gets into that, and like most of our songs, doesn't give an easy answer, because there's no easy answer for losing a child. There's nothing that could prepare someone for losing a child. But I do believe, I believe that life and experience continues after the grave, and I believe that these beautiful children are experiencing something greater, a greater reality. And so this song is for those people, sort of just so that they know that they're seen, you know, and that it's okay to not be okay, and it's gonna take a lifetime to grasp, you know, what you went through in losing a child. But I think it's a topic, you know, to be discussed, and the worst thing some people do is they say, I don't know what to say, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so they ostracize those people. And the last thing you need when you're grieving is to be left alone. I mean, maybe you do for a little bit, but you don't need to be treated like a pariah, you know, for losing the most valuable thing you've ever had, the life of your child. So that song explores that, you know. And when I say, I memorized your pain, I put my thoughts inside your name, that's a statement of who I am, you know, became you, child, and now you're gone, and I'm trying to figure out who I am now. And so I guess, like most of the songs, there's kind of a question of identity there. Lower Empire is basically one large look at borders, at immigration, at some of these kind of macro apocalypse moments as we entered into the 21st century. One of the main questions, I think, if the world's still around in 2300, they'll look at this century as trying to redefine what national identity looks like. Because in an increasingly globalized society where, you know, we can talk on the internet, we can fly over here, and we can experience one another and be like, oh, I guess Australians and Americans aren't so different besides the accent, you know. Or you call it a Q, we call it a line, or something like that. You realize that national identity, in large part, you know, was promoted by people in power to sort of create a culture, a hegemony, a dominance over the people that they rule. And we've seen certain instances in history, in really modern history, that this song looks at. One of them would be South African apartheid, and you know, looking at a culture that was, you know, dominated by what was ethnically a minority of white and, you know, primarily Dutch people over the larger you know, black African group, and kind of examining some of the horrors and the atrocities that happened in the social unrest that follows when we define each other by nationality, you know, or by race, instead of just seeing the humanity in one another. And so Lower Empire is investigating these things, and I say, you know, these borders were forged and lost, painted with the martyr's forgotten blood, and the idea that when you look at a political border, you're looking at violence almost all the time. And especially in America, when you look at that line between Mexico and America, you're looking at betrayal and violence and treaties broken. And so in a way, it's sort of a follow-up to our song Native Blood that talks about the genocide of Native American people. And this one's kind of, instead of looking back at just that, it's looking at, well, what do we have now? You know, we have these nation states, we have these people that say, I'm an American and that person isn't. Well, what does it mean to be American? You know, is it a color of skin thing? Because, you know, I was raised to believe that it's a melting pot, and the idea of America is that anyone can be, you know, an American. And then you have Donald Trump becoming president. And, you know, I would be lying if I said this song wasn't spurred on by comments he made about people from Mexico and comments that he's made about the border wall. Because it's directly in the stories of atrocities of children killed during the apartheid riots. And one of them is, I forget his name, but he's mentioned in the song and in our footnotes, or you look at, the song at the beginning, I say, "Invader, you dare make me a stranger. You brand me as a traitor." And that our history is a history of people conquering people and taking. And I think that we do so much damage when we promote the myth of of mixing ethnicity with nationality. And to this day, we see groups like the alt-right and the Ku Klux Klan is still active, and neo-Nazis, and people that are promoting this idea of white national identities. And realizing that that's a myth, one, because white doesn't mean anything. And the whole Aryan thing that the Nazis created is a total fabrication. And two, national identity is changing so much. Yeah, it's coming to where, I'm trying to learn my Spanish every day because more and more people I meet speak Spanish, and realizing that that's not a problem. That doesn't mean American culture is being eroded. It means it's shifting, and that's what it means to grow. And so civilization is growing, and so I'm looking at these, what I call the lower empire or the nation states that we have created, because ultimately those will one day be antiquated because they are not necessary, and in a lot of ways I think they stand between human progress. So, yeah. It's again, my goal to do with this album, and I'm still trying to figure it out because it's kind of an absurd undertaking, but I'm trying to understand how these macro apocalypse moments, these watershed moments in history that have changed our world forever, like the Spanish Civil War, or the chemical warfare that we discuss in The New Eternity, or lower empire and our shifting understanding of nationality, how those mix in with our micro crises or with our micro apocalypse. And I think to find the answers that we're looking at, so often we're looking outside, we're looking throughout history in the world, but we actually, I think, need to look inside of ourselves and see, and to really, I think to change the world, you have to be able to change yourself. And in the previous song, actually, in Lower Empire, say, how can you resist the cycle if you can't resist yourself? And I said that sort of as a response to, I see so many people saying, resist Donald Trump, resist, resist, resist. And by no means am I mocking them, because I think there's a lot of him that should be resisted. But it's like, well, what are you gonna do to resist? Because a hashtag on social media isn't gonna change, isn't gonna lead to the social change that you need. To really change things, you need to be willing to look at yourself. Like we talk about in After Dusk, and like you poignantly asked me, what changes are you willing to make for the environment? And so that's something I've been dealing with. Like, how can I eat less, things that are, destructive to the environment and consume them less? How can I just use less water bottles? Because I don't need to keep using the same, I can use the same water bottle, And so the question of how to deal with these big and incredible, overwhelming ideas that at first you can get excited about, but then you get exhausted because you're like, oh, I can never change them. The way to change those things is to actually, I think, look within, and that's what, in part, what Carl Jung is saying. To understand the mysteries of the universe, you have to look in, and I think the same. To change what we see in this world, you have to be willing to change yourself. So the Anatomy of Time Babel is sort of two things. It's one, it's a discussion about aliens, as weird as that is, and two, it's about language. And those things actually come together based on a movie that I saw, which is probably my favorite modern movie. It's called Arrival, and any language nerd should see it. Arrival deals with this idea of, well, what if aliens came, but instead of them being nefarious Martians that are trying to blast us, they're a highly advanced species that we've never seen anything like, but their language is so different. And so that movie and the song really gets into the Wittgensteinian notion of thought is bound within language. And how that plays out is, so I love it. So the Germans have a word called Schadenfreude, to take pleasure in someone's pain. And I'm not saying that says anything about the German people, but I think it's so funny that they have a term for, and that's like an emotion, that's an experience. And we don't have a word for that. And so when we take pleasure in people's pain, you know, you can say like, oh, I'm happy, but that sounds weird. It's because that's a specific thing, a specific emotion. And I find that as you encounter cultures and languages, I think the mind kind of expands and grows. And so the anatomy of time is looking at, well, you know, what if we were to encounter a language or a species like that of a rival that changes our understanding of time? That because all of our language is so bound within time of when, you know, and how and where. It's all very it's all chronology. And imagining this anachronistic or this like non-chronological language and how that could actually change our perception of time. And so that song is kind of my first sci-fi song, but it's kind of the idea of like, what would happen if I encountered something that shattered my notions of time, and how would that change the self? And so the reason I said Babel is in Genesis, probably the most fascinating thing in the Bible to me is that humans are trying to build this tower to heaven, and Lord knows why or what that was. I don't know what the purpose was. I think they just wanted to be as cool as God. They wanted to get up to God, and they thought God was in the sky, so we're gonna climb. Okay, so they build this tower. And then God says, come, let us bring them language so as to confuse them, and they will be scattered across the nation. So sure enough, everyone basically was given a different language. And of course, the question isn't, oh, did that really happen? Does that exist? The question is, what does that myth tell us? Because we always think of language as a helpful tool, but what if language is actually divisive? And that's why I love music, because I'm convinced that music is the universal language, that music cuts through so much of the detail and the fog and actually challenges us to really find something deeper, to experience deeper emotional states. And that's in part why I think I see, you know, grown tough guy men like crying at shows, because the music is saying something to them that linguistically they've cut off. You know, maybe we've cut off all the emotional language, but music finds a way to, it's like water under a door, it finds a way to get in. And so the song is really kind of examining time and language and asking, you know, what could happen that would give us a paradigm shift and would help us to really have a revolution in language and time, and how are language and time even connected? Because that's another thing I'm struggling with as I learn more about Spanish, and time is kind of different in the language. But yeah, anyways. This was the last depth song. There won't be any others. Gonna make it a trilogy, just not as good as most trilogies, but a trilogy nonetheless. I guess to give some background, Depths 1 is one of the first songs we ever wrote as a band. I think it's the first not bad song we wrote as a band. And it was dealing with a whole lot of emotions. One of my best friends who went to prison, I started the band with him, and then he went to prison. I wrote that song going through that process of losing him. And then Depths 2 I wrote through the process of being diagnosed bipolar and losing myself, I guess, and then finding myself. And Depths 3 is sort of a question of, okay, so where do I go? You know, now that I've found myself, but I also realize that to some extent, I'll always have these struggles. You know, life isn't a movie ending. You know, I mean, there's movie endings within your life, but then you wake up the next day and a new movie begins. And I guess true to kind of what the album's about is there's always an end, and then the end signals a beginning. And I think the challenge in life is to find where is that beginning after the end. Instead of giving up hope and saying, okay, that's the end of my hope, is to find where is hope now, you know, that my world has like shifted so dramatically. And so Depths 3, it kind of picks up at the end of the album. I'm dropped in the middle of the ocean after seeing all these stories and basically moving through matter and time in the middle of a black ocean that is almost space, just kind of a void. And in the doldrums, you have the word doldrums here, and kind of in the doldrums of existence, of my experience of depression, where weeks can feel like months, can feel like you just kind of lose track of everything loses its color and loses its flavor and loses its distinction. And kind of, as I was writing that song and experiencing some sort of depression onset by studio and living in New Jersey for 8 weeks, I started, I asked a lot of questions, and those questions were in that song. And, I say, Sister Moon, are we all that's left? Just a silent sigh of light and the sigh of flesh. And I say, should I call this art, my falling apart? The idea that I'm constantly writing my pain into songs and thinking, is that even art? Is that just therapy? Is this just, like, what's the point, of all of this? And then at the end, experiencing kind of the hope of a sun rising, and the fact that no despair, no hopelessness is going to last forever. And that's kind of what I want people to take away from that song. And so I say I was inhaled by the breath of existence. And then at the very end, I imagine that every single apocalypse that I envision kind of as a sun, and I'm taking this a bit from Dante's Paradiso, collides into one great sun. And I say, breathe me in, and you'll watch me burn. And the idea is that I think the answer that I came away with in our first album was that I was in God's, that God wasn't dreaming, but instead I was dreaming. The evil that I see was a reflection of myself. And then the last album, I realized that to find true meaning, we need to find each other, and we need to share like our pain with each other. And in this album, I think sort of my takeaway from the apocalypse, sort of the personal moral of the story, I guess you would, is that to find love and to find value and to find hope, I need to let go. I need to be breathed. I say breathed in, but the idea is that I need to, instead of trying to like push the boat that I'm in the story the way that I need it to go, that I need to actually just let these forces move me. And I need to be able to move and to change with the seasons, instead of demanding, oh, this is my life, this is how it needs to go, and actually being able to be like influenced and shifted. Kind of like my voice is effed up. I need to go on stage and move my voice with that, and to really embrace the now, instead of constantly feeling victimized and constantly, saying this isn't the life that I wanted, but instead to accept that this is the life that I have. And to be thankful for every day. So it's kind of the takeaway from Depths 3, and I can't promise you a lot of things, but I can say our next album will continue where that one left off, being burned alive by the sun. So.